Welcome to Making the Grade, the podcast that explores what's driving the decline in graduation rates between funding rounds and what it really takes to scale a venture-backed software startup successfully with realistic options to exit. I'm Tom Glasson, CEO at Scalewise, and each week I'm going to be joined by founders, investors, and some of the best go-to-market leaders in the world to unpack the strategies, the missteps, and the mindset shifts that separate those who graduate from those who don't. Expect real talk, actionable go-to-market insights, and honest stories that will help you scale more wisely and thrive in an increasingly competitive market. Because there is a smarter way to scale, and we're here to uncover it. What does it really take to build a sustainable startup in today's climate? With funding harder to come by, founder burnout and mental health challenges on the rise, and pressure to scale faster than ever, the path from seed to Series D, I don't think has ever been more complex. And today we're going to be diving into the reality of building and growing a venture-backed business, from product market fit and co-founder dynamics to mergers and acquisitions, resilience, and redefining what success actually looks like. And to help me unpack all of that, I'm joined by someone who's been there, done that, and I think it's fair to say definitely caught the t-shirt. I'm joined by Justin Fitzpatrick. He's a serial entrepreneur with several exits under his belt. Justin's currently the CEO of ESG Book. They're a fintech combining market-leading data and analytics with an intuitive disclosure platform to reduce the regulatory reporting burden and help companies meet their sustainability goals. I'm also joined by my good friend and marketing leader, Munyahoto, to dive even more into scaling a business in the current climate without losing your sanity or your options to exit. So let's get into it. Welcome, Justin, to Making the Grade. I'm really pleased that you could join us for our first episode in the season. How are you, firstly?
Yeah, I'm great. And thank you for having me, Tom and Munya. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Amazing. So Justin, we both know you over the years. We know that you've had a pretty incredible career. Maybe you can just give us a bit of a whistle-stop tour of that career to date and share some of the biggest milestones or things that you're maybe most proud of over the last few years.
Yeah, sure. So I guess just as, kind of level setting and background on me, I grew up outside of Boston. My parents were entrepreneurs. They actually owned a bagel bakery. So I kind of a slightly different model of entrepreneurship. But, I think that early exposure to a family business ignited a lot of the passion that I now have for building things. Out of university, not really having the confidence or the resources to start a business myself at that point, I went and did the next best thing, which is work for a successful entrepreneur. So I joined a business called Gerson Learning Group, which today remains one of the largest primary research platforms in the world. And, I was very fortunate to kind of join that business right at one of its major inflection points. So came in after the Series B, which Bessemer Ventures led. Company was about 100 employees at that point in time, mainly in the US, doing about 20 million of revenue and, kind of classic growth company profile. And over the next 5 years, we grew that business to over 1,000 employees and 250 million in revenue. So as a kind of first exposure to building a venture-backed business, it was a pretty amazing model. I spent the 5 years with GLG really pushing out the frontier for them in several respects, starting the tech media telecom research group for the APAC region, and then ultimately co-founding and running the Singapore and Tokyo offices. And so, that experience gave me a really rounded set of skills that I could then take into building a business. After GLG, the clouds of the financial crisis were looming. I figured that was a pretty good time to go to grad school. And so that's what brought me to the UK. I started getting connected into the London venture and tech scene. So in the course of finishing my master's in finance at London Business School, I worked for a local venture fund, MMC Ventures, who's about to celebrate its 25th anniversary. So, has been around the London venture scene for quite some time. And that was great because, I not only got to build my network, but I got to understand how venture capital funds evaluate businesses and think about investing in businesses that can scale and have a real impact. That experience also kind of taught me that at that point in my life, I didn't want to be a venture investor. I really wanted to be an operator, and I wanted to scratch that itch of building something great. So, from MMC, that was really the beginning of my entrepreneurial journey in earnest. And that was the point at which I co-founded Doodle with my co-founder, Damian Kimmelman, who seeded that business and built the original platform. We had a long and winding road building Doodle, but one that was ultimately successful. So coming to kind of some of the highlights, there were a lot of exciting moments in the early part of the business, because I think one of the things that Damien did particularly well was he kind of was able to identify a sort of moment at that point in time, which was really focused around bringing greater levels of transparency to private company information. That was a message that really resonated with people. And the alternative products at the time, the ways that people were getting that information were really causing a lot of pain points in the market. And so that was the beginning of Doodle. I think the other thing that it taught me, though, was that, ultimately, well, that was sort of necessary. It wasn't sufficient to build a great business. And there were a lot of other aspects that we probably weren't as familiar with early on that we ultimately needed to learn and incorporate into the business plan. In 2018, I took over the business as CEO from Damien, who went on to go and found another business in a different space. And that then gave me the opportunity and a little bit of the freedom to start to lead the business in the direction that I thought it should go in and kind of bring more of my vision into the building of the business. And so that's ultimately what led us to two things. One was really doubling down on Doodle as a reg tech solution for UK financial institutions. And then ultimately to the merger that we executed with Artesian Solutions back in 2021 to create Full Circle.
Yeah, well, I'm sure we're going to come on to some of those winding parts of the road and the pivots along the way. But that wasn't the end of the story, Full Circle, was it? I think it sounds like there was a subsequent exit then. And then, maybe bring us up to the current day and your role as it stands.
Yeah, you're right. There was a lot more to the story. So we put Doodle and Artesian together in the second half of 2021 and ultimately created what is today known as Full Circle. With Full Circle, we wanted to have, having learned about what investors look for, what, strategic acquirers look for, we put the two businesses together very deliberately because we saw an opportunity to create an asset of scale that had really compelling financial metrics, but ultimately also have a proposition that was really unique within the market. And so we went through all the hard yards of integrating two teams, two cultures, sort of creating a new brand identity, stitching together product and technology teams. There was a lot that went into it. But ultimately, that gave us a really great platform that then allowed us to go and do it again. And so in 2023, we acquired a company called W2 Global, which was a compliance orchestration platform to round out a lot of the Full Circle proposition. And, as you alluded to, Tom, in October of last year, we were fortunate to have Full Circle be acquired by one of our core partners, nCino, which is a NASDAQ listed provider of cloud banking solutions. So got to kind of see that full journey from beginning to end.
There's a number of things that strike me about your journey, Justin. The question that comes from many people that are attempting a journey like yours is, how did you meet a co-founder that was ideal to be able to go on this incredible journey together? And do you have any kind of pearls of wisdom around that idea?
Yeah, I would say that it was more that the moment found me and we kind of found each other. I think that chemistry is really important because at the end of the day, you end up spending more time with your co-founder than you do with your spouse and your friends, right? In our case, Damien actually came in to pitch MMC very early doors. And we were both American. We kind of knew some of the same people, even though we came from quite different backgrounds. And it was clear to us that we had quite different skill sets. And so through that initial meeting at MMC, I think we were probably drawing similar conclusions. I was thinking this probably isn't the right investor for him. And he was probably thinking the same, but we were both there going, you know what, there might be something to this in terms of our relationship. We just kept kind of reaching out to each other and grabbing coffee and running through different ideas for the business. And then he would sort of invite me to lunch and introduce one of the investors. And so it just really was quite an organic thing. I mean, it was a little bit like dating, if I have to be honest, and I think that's, unless you have a co-founder that you've known for a really long time and you've worked together in a previous role, which, is arguably has a lot of strengths if you do have that person in your life. I would sort of encourage you to think about it like dating, because too often I've had friends who have started businesses and they think they need a co-founder because they're doing it for the first time. And they sort of rush into finding somebody who they think complements their skill set. Maybe they're a non-technical founder. And so they go out and they get a technical co-founder, and it's sort of the first person that expresses an interest in having the title CTO in their business. And that very rarely is a successful strategy. So I think knowing what you need to complement you, and then taking the time to really meet different people and suss that out, where there's not only a skills fit, but also a personal fit is just super important.
Yeah, super, super important. And yeah, I think what you touched on there around you spending more time with your founder or your co-founder than your wife or your friends is such an important point. I think about my co-founder at Scalewise and, who's my wife as well, by the way, as well as my friend Gavin.
You did the 2-for-1.
Yeah, I got the 2-for-1. And that creates an interesting dynamic. I have to say, there is very little downtime in our house, weekends, holidays. Yeah, we're talking a lot about the business. But I'd love to just come back to something you said earlier, Justin, which is you talked about, the journey kind of almost never being up and to the right and the winding roads, I think you said, and pivoting seems to be such an important part of any early stage growth journey. And it sounds like you've had a few of those pivots and kind of resets along the way. Maybe you can share maybe a little more about what drove those pivots for you. And also importantly, how you kept the resilience to kind of keep going, because I know that those pivots can be quite taxing on leaders and on organizations. I've certainly been through them myself in my career. So yeah, maybe share more about what drove those pivots and how you kept that resilience going.
I mean, I think there are, two things that frequently kind of force those pivots. One is a kind of ultimate recognition that you might not have the product market fit that you thought you had, right? And after you've raised a couple rounds of early stage funding and you realize that people aren't backing you anymore on an idea or a kind of story, they're starting to back you on what are the real results. It forces that kind of reconciliation where you got to go, okay, what do we really have here and how can we scale it? So, I think that was definitely the case with Doodle. Like, we had built a great product that was getting a lot of traction, but the business model wasn't working in the way that we thought it was going to work. And, although maybe there was a viable business model there, it was just proving, too costly to kind of scale it in the way that we wanted to. And so there was that series of difficult conversations within the organization about who we wanted to be and what problems we wanted to solve, and really starting to obsess about that product market fit. I think the other thing that drives a pivot is our external factors out of your control. I mean, we sort of, I didn't fully complete the early part of the story, which is what am I doing now? I'm now CEO of a company called ESG Book, which is a sustainability data and disclosure platform. And the sustainability market, as we've seen, has changed quite dramatically, not just in the last 2 or 3 years, but actually in the last 2 or 3 months. and so you sometimes have these external factors that, force a repositioning, if not a full pivot of the business. But I would say that whether you are kind of facing that choice of, do I have to quote unquote do a hard pivot or not? It's a really healthy habit as you're building the business to constantly question the relevance of what you're building and reassess the tightness of the product market fit, right? And that starts with deeply understanding the use case and the pain points and what's driving those pain points within your core personas. And I think there are kind of too many businesses that make that classic mistake of building something because they think it's a great idea, but not really understanding what drives the people who they're expecting to adopt the solution. And so that's something that, I've definitely learned the hard way and have then brought into my subsequent roles where I've run product at Full Circle and now at ESG Book as well.
And what are those kind of early indicators for a business that suggest that they need to pivot? Because one of the things that I see with clients that we support in Scalewise is maybe a reluctance to pivot or maybe pivoting too late. So can you give us a sense as like, how do you determine whether now's the time to pivot or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the term pivot is also possibly a bit misleading and sometimes unhelpful because it sort of implies that you've got to do something like totally different from what you're doing today. And like, that's at least the way that a lot of people conceive of that concept of pivot. But actually, rather than, completely turning the ship in a totally different direction, it's also often a matter of course correcting and actually connecting things that are already working within the organization, but maybe not in as joined up a way as you need. Right. And so, I'll give you a very specific example. So, oftentimes you have something that the market wants, and you can tell because, people are coming to you organically, right? Even if they're not always paying for it or not always converting into clients, you're attracting some level of interest, right? But if you're starting to see poor retention on the client side, or you're starting to see, really long sales cycles, or you're not able to achieve the average order values that you want to achieve, like those are all hints that you don't have the product market fit as tight as it needs to be. And that relationship between, I would say product, marketing, and sales, getting that working as one kind of tightly coordinated group is so important. And there are a lot of businesses that might do parts of those things well, but they don't join it up in the right way. And so again, that just then shows up as prolonged sales processes or poor win rates or, all of these factors. I think it's really easy for us to kind of look at the sales metrics and then like beat up on sales and say, oh, well, we need to hire better salespeople. But actually, if you only are hiring salespeople of above average intelligence and resilience and motivation and skill, it's a really poor strategy to scale your business. You almost want to be able to hire people who are very average at their roles in sales and make them overachieve because all of those other parts of the proposition are so compelling. And so you have to obviously drive higher kind of discipline and execution within a sales function as you do every function in the business. But I think people tend to over rely on that as either a kind of source of the issue or a potential solution when things aren't quite working. And what I would say is it's better to adopt a much broader perspective and look at the relationship between, the product and how the product is addressing the need of the end user, how you're then communicating that to the end user, and then what the sales execution looks like in order to support that and get it out into the market. So it's more for me a matter of like looking across those different areas and identifying the opportunities to optimize rather than saying, oh, we were going in this direction and now we have to go in that direction.
Justin, I find it fascinating talking to CEOs because I think you guys occupy a really unique, almost irrational kind of seat at the table. For example, I was listening to Brian Chesky talk about Airbnb when the COVID moment came, and you're describing kind of moments of change where the business has an existential crisis almost. And he goes on to reflect that weak businesses are taken out by a crisis. Okay, businesses will survive a crisis, but great businesses will thrive in a crisis. But how do you build that resilience? To Tom's initial question, what is it? How do you keep yourself focused on taking the business to that place that nobody else maybe at that point in time believes the business can get to? What do you feed? What are you reading? Who's on the phone to you during those difficult times?
Yeah. It's a really great point, Munya. So I think there are a couple critical aspects to it. The first is that as a founder, as a CEO, it obviously requires, a tremendous amount of personal reserve, right? In terms of, being able to develop and draw on that resilience. And so I think, and this is why, there's so much attention given to the topic of kind of founder and entrepreneur mental health, because if, you're not, taking care of your own house, then it's going to be very difficult to get other people in the organization to kind of come behind you and kind of work with you through those difficult moments. So I think kind of taking care of yourself, it's like that thing on an airplane, right? Like they always tell you, if the mask drops, you got to put your own mask on first before helping others. And I think that's also true in moments of crisis or volatility within the context of building a business. I think the other thing too is being able to communicate openly and transparently with people in the organization about, not only what's going well, but also the things that need to be improved and having really concrete plans for that. I think there's a tendency within the VC community to kind of over-index on, the quote unquote kind of visionary founder. And I'm not sort of taking anything away from that because I think it's really important to be able to communicate a compelling vision because that's what gets people fired up. But you can't just have that. You also have to have a credible plan for how you're going to get from A to B as a business. And, people will kind of go along with like overhyped and sort of fanciful targets for a little while. But if you have, it doesn't take very long of not hitting those targets before you start to kind of lose the room and lose your audience. And so, I think a lot of this is about framing the expectations and the objectives of the organization in a way that people feel like it's ambitious and it's in service to that vision, but it's also achievable. And you're there to kind of be a fair dealer in terms of pointing out where people aren't making the grade, but also help them to achieve higher and higher levels of performance. So, it's something that we really think about is bringing that clarity and accountability into the organization. And that runs in all directions, right? It's not just me holding people in the organization accountable, but it's being, vulnerable enough and being transparent enough with the team about what's working and what isn't for them to hold me accountable as well.
I'd love to kind of just move on to now talking about, a big issue we see in the startup and scale up ecosystem, which is this drastically declining graduation rates between funding rounds. Now, you've been through multiple funding rounds. You've seen successful M&A as well. Maybe you can share a little bit more about that M&A process itself, because that's almost like the panacea for a lot of these founders and CEOs. They're looking to get to that exit point, whether that's a trade sale or a merger or maybe even an IPO. But can you just share a bit more about how you planned for that exit with Due Dil and some of the key lessons along the way there as well?
Yeah, for sure. So as always, there were things that we did well and things that we learned from, which we then applied in the subsequent acquisition and integration of W2. But one of the things that we did well up front in that process is Andrew Yates, my co-founder of Full Circle, who is one of the founders and the CEO of Artesian, and I got together quite early on, and we really started thinking about, does this not just make sense from a cap table and financial, profile perspective, but, does this make sense from a product proposition and a cultural perspective, right? And I think that those are things that, they should actually be the first things that you discuss, right? Forget about what the arithmetic says on how much revenue you have and how much revenue the other company has and what it could be together. People always talk about this 1 + 1 = 3 thing. And we know statistically that something like 80 or 90% of M&A is unsuccessful, right? It fails to achieve that 1 + 1 = 3. I think oftentimes it's because, people are paying too much attention to the financial and cap table side of things, the kind of deal itself rather than the rationale for the deal. And so, it's not that one is better than the other or more important than the other. It's about, giving each part the attention that it deserves. And for me, any successful M&A has to start with what is the new vision for this proposition that we're creating by bringing together these products and these companies. And then culturally, do we have enough overlap in our DNA for that to be successful so that you're not, the body doesn't reject the transplanted organ, so to speak, right? And so just very concretely, one of the things that we did with, as a group of new potential co-founders with so me on the Due Dil side and the 3 co-founders of Artesian on the other side, we actually ran a half-a-day facilitated workshop where we looked at not just our culture and values within the organization, but we looked at specific individuals that we thought embodied those values within our respective organizations. We talked about specific scenarios where the values are kind of called into question and they need to be applied. And then we finished that exercise by actually constructing a straw man for a new combined set of values. So, we kind of took what were then the Due Dil values and then the Artesian values. And we said, where are the points of overlap or commonality, and how could we rephrase this so that we have a new set of values that we can bring to the organization? Now, we ultimately reran that exercise after we did, very soon after completing the merger, because we wanted to get more people in the company involved in that so that they bought into it as well. But it was interesting because what we ultimately landed on, which we called our graft values, growth mindset, resourcefulness, accountability, being factual and team oriented. they were actually pretty close to that first straw man that we created. So I think, kind of spending the time on that is, thinking about where are the points of connection within the product and the proposition. How is this going to gel from a cultural perspective? That's almost the thing that you need to do before you figure out how are we going to carve up the cap table and where the synergy is going to be.
Justin, that's super interesting, that thoughtfulness and that consideration about, the morning after, the night before, proverbially. When you're doing that kind of thing, do you need to protect the organization from the kind of what if it doesn't happen, feeling, how much of a distraction can this be for the day-to-day operations? And how do you thread that needle between knowing, we want to do something really special, something different, but at the same time, we've got to keep the lights on and we've got to keep everybody focused, because if it doesn't happen, we've still got to show up on Monday and drive the business forward in a good way.
Yeah, it's a great question, Munya, and it is a real challenge, like through these processes, because you're right, they are incredibly distracting. I had already left Full Circle before the acquisition by Encino, but I was very intimately involved in preparing the ground for that and the run up to that, and which we can talk more about what that looked like. But we kind of said to the executive team, we almost need two teams here, right? We almost need to split the executive team, and we need a SWAT team focused on pushing this deal forward. But equally important, we need to know that there's a core of the leadership who's still focused on executing the day to day, because the number one thing that blows up funding rounds and M&A is the business going off of its plan, right? So you're kind of getting deeper into the DD. The business is you're kind of getting less and less of your time because you're more and more focused on the deal, and the metrics start to drift, right? And that's an absolute killer. So in terms of how you kind of maintain the focus and you maintain the momentum and you walk that tightrope of sharing enough to keep get people excited, but not so much that they lose motivation if it doesn't happen. I think this is an area where, you do need to be thoughtful about what you share with whom, when, and I mean, it's not going to work unless you bring other people into it. So you want to go through a certain level of qualification, I think, at a very senior level to make sure that there's a there before you start talking to other people about it. But, you do need to start bringing other people into it selectively. The thing that we've always tried to do is we've really engaged in these types of M&A discussions where we think that there is that strong fit from a proposition perspective. And so, we kind of go into it open-minded to say, look, maybe the ultimate and best outcome is a successful transaction, right? Where we actually do come together in some way, whatever that looks like. But you should only really be doing that if you think that there's something of value that organization can bring to yours. And so, we've also been very flexible and very open with people and say, like, maybe we don't quite get all the way there on this successful M&A, but there's a really great partnership for us that we can explore.
Absolutely. And obviously, exits can be a great liquidity event. It can be a great outcome for shareholders, but I think they're becoming increasingly harder to come by nowadays for lots of different reasons. And a lot of the companies that maybe raised in 2021 and 2022 are maybe falling off the venture track a little bit as well. And I think there's lots of conversation still about how to raise and how to approach VCs, but not that many about, what you do when you do fall off that VC track. Maybe you can share any advice for founders who may have fallen off that VC track. How do you think about outcomes there? Is an exit still an option? And if so, how should they be thinking about their metrics and how to position themselves for that exit when maybe they haven't got that venture growth rate anymore? Any ideas that you can share with people would be great.
Yeah, it's a great question. The majority of a venture fund isn't going to return a venture style, a venture scale return, right? So I think it's something that, founders need to be thinking of, and it shouldn't, detract from their ambition to create a company that could have a venture scale return. But this is where the humility comes in, because sometimes it's not fully in your control, right? And you have to figure out what a plan B is. Just because you aren't building a venture scale business, by the way, also doesn't mean that you can't build a really great business or you aren't building something of value. So in terms of how you navigate that, I think the starting point is asking yourself two questions and answering these two questions really honestly. The first is, how far off track am I from the metrics that somebody is going to want to see? Right. And that somebody might not necessarily be a venture fund. Sometimes it is possible to take a business that maybe had a misstep and get it back onto a venture trajectory. And then I think the second question that you need to ask yourself, which is equally, if not more important, is as a founder or as a founding team that's, probably devoted a significant portion of your life and resources to building this. It's like, what do you actually want at this point? What do you really want? If the kind of venture dream of, an IPO and world domination is no longer an option, it's like, what do you want to get out of your experience building a business, right? And for me, the point at Doodle where things were getting tough and we were contemplating different options and asking ourselves those hard questions, I realized that, I didn't at that point necessarily want to build a quote unquote unicorn anymore, right? Like that wasn't really what was motivating me. I wanted to build a business with staying power that was having a real impact in the world, where I could work with great clients, where we could build a great product, but also do it in a way that it wasn't completely consuming my life and destroying me. Quite simply, because the toll is, let's face it, the toll can be really high, right? And so, for me, a part of it was being proud of what I was doing and having a great team, but ultimately having a role in a company that was working for me, not just me working for it all the time. And so I think once you've figured out like the answer to those two questions, you then have options, right? And they might not necessarily be the options that you thought about when you started the journey. They very rarely are, but you still have options, and you realize that there are ways of building great businesses and having the lifestyle and the impact that you want that don't necessarily involve raising further rounds of venture funding.
Justin, those are some incredible insights, and I wish we had more time to kind of keep piquing your brain. But one question that I have as we wrap up is crystal ball time. If you knew then what you know now, and you are looking at, the startup ecosystem as it stands today, what do you think should happen to improve graduation rates in startups right now? What would your kind of sage advice be to that founder or that CEO or that executive team that really wants to make it from C to A to B, but doesn't know what you know now?
Yeah. So I think when I reflect on my previous experience and where I wish I had done things differently, I guess it comes down to two things, right? One is I wish that we had not just obsessed around the functionality of the product, but obsessed around the problem that we were solving and the persona that we were solving that problem for, right? It's a simple thing, right? And it's something that any startup entrepreneurial blog you read about it, any product blog, it talks about the importance of understanding the use case and the persona and the pain points. But, it's really easy when you're in it to actually like lose focus on that or not stay as focused on that as you should be. The other thing I think is in parallel to that is the importance of getting out and talking to clients early, because I've also seen businesses that are really product obsessed businesses, but, they almost they don't want to show their work until it's done, and I think that's a real error, right? You need to not only be in front of clients early, like to improve the product, but you need to be asking that hard question of like, what would it take for you to pay for this? Right. And, because people are going to give you all kinds of, make all kinds of encouraging noises and give you all kinds of feedback and, like play around with your product, but it's then quite a different thing for them to actually put their hand in their pocket and write a check and say, yeah, we're willing to commit to you for a 1, 2, 3 year contract in the context of, enterprise software. So I think just putting yourself in the firing line as early as possible is really, really important.
There's a lot to be said for capital efficiency and building sustainable businesses that don't burn us out. And I think, I've taken so much from this conversation, Justin. I think, both Munya and I are hugely appreciative of your time and sharing your lessons along the way. And I get the sense we could talk for hours more around all of these topics, but we don't want to take any more of your time. We really appreciate you being our first guest on Making the Grade. We hope to catch up again soon. And yeah, thanks again for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks so much, guys. I really, really enjoyed the conversation, and yeah, look forward to an opportunity to do it again.
Amazing. Thank you so much for listening to Making the Grade. We really hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you have any questions following this episode, or you'd like to recommend a guest perhaps for our next season, please let us know at podcast@scalewise.com. And if you did enjoy today's episode, please do consider leaving us a review on either Apple Podcasts or Spotify. We'd really appreciate that. As this is a brand new show, reviews really help us spread the word and reach new listeners. Plus, we'd also love to hear what you're enjoying about our show. Thank you so much for your support, and see you soon for another episode of Making the Grade.